We're going to transition very quickly now to the policy roundtable. And to do that, I would like to invite up our payer participant and one on the phone, and our manufacturer representatives on the roundtable. So it'll just take us literally 2 minutes at most to get situated for that. Does that sound all right? There we go. All right, I'm going to do my Phil Donahue imitation here and walk in front of you nice people for a while. So let's introduce everybody again on the policy roundtable. You've met the patient representatives and our 2 clinical experts. Again, we have some new representatives from the manufacturers that we'd like to introduce, as well as one payer representative who is here with us in person and another on the phone. So Denise and Rocio, can I ask you to introduce yourselves, please?
Sure. So I'm Denise Globe, and I'm a full-time employee of Novartis Oncology.
And hello, everybody. My name is Rocio Mangani, and I also work for Kite Pharma.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Malin. I'm the Senior Medical Director for Oncology and Genetics at United Healthcare, and I volunteer seeing patients in the oncology clinic at the West Los Angeles VA.
Right. And on the phone with us, we have John Yao. John, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can anyone hear me?
Great. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm John Yao. I'm a Staff Vice President for Medical Policy and Technology at Anthem.
All right. I hope that meant we didn't just lose you, but we'll see. All right. So John Yao from Anthem. And what we're going to do now is talk about a lot of things. My policy roundtable notes are 2 days worth of really good discussions. And each of you could speak for 3 to 4 hours on each of these points. So forgive me in advance for what will seem like a rush through a bunch of important issues, but we are going to try to capture a very broad number of policy issues related to how we're actually going to use this in practice, educate patients and families, price and pay for it, and do the research now that needs to be done for the future to be able to make better decisions in an hour. Okay? Easy. Let's start actually back with the patients again. So we've talked a little bit about hype versus hope, and where this now sits with the clinical experts, talking about it as game-changing. You've been part, obviously, of the conversations in the patient community. What do patients today need to know about their treatment options that you think it's actually hard for them to find out about, and we should, as a system, figure out a better way to get that information to them or engage them in decision-making? Is it around risks? Is it around transportation to the centers? Or what are the biggest needs from the patient community right now?
I would say it's kind of threefold. It starts off, the first thing the patient cares about and wants to know about is about the treatment itself and the risks involved, the side effects. That's kind of the first thing that they would need to be educated on and care about. The next thing is going to be the logistics, because this is only available at about 30, well, I'm going to speak for yes, CARTA, but it's available at about 35, 36 facilities right now. So that means that most patients will be traveling to receive treatment, and so then the logistics come in. And so then they're having just those questions about travel, lodging, where the caregivers will stay, and how that will work. And then finally, the last part that the patients kind of then start to look for is what next? Like, what happens after they complete treatment? What are the long-term effects? What can I expect just short-term, long-term? And then kind of the emotional aspect of it too. So psychologically, what they'll need after care. So.
I agree with everything that Emily said. And when I've myself and have talked to other families that have been through what we have been through, it is, the aftercare, having kind of a schedule, an outline of what's expected, at what intervals. I know that was ever changing for us since we were so early on, and that was ever changing throughout the process. So having a better idea of what was expected afterwards in terms of what labs are drawn at what time intervals, where they're going to be And then the IVIG administration and what the long-term, again, it's early on, and when we did it, obviously, and it wasn't really known, is this something that, my son's going to have to do in the long term? What does that mean for him, in terms of, his future, healthcare and insurance and stuff like that, and just that kind of for us initially was not really said, what the expectation was. If this did work, then, the long-term repercussions of the treatment.
It sounds really daunting, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's daunting for the hospitals that are seeking to provide this service to try to pull together this information. Each patient and each family situation is going to be different, but they're looking for reliable information. What's happening at the clinical center level now in terms of rolling this out? What are the big barriers, and how are you thinking about supporting patients through some of the issues that were just raised?
In our experience, and it's still early days, I think the biggest challenge is the uncertainty, particularly around the long-term effects and long-term management. There's just not, this is new, and it's offering something to patients who have very, very few options, which is fantastic. The challenge is that we just don't have answers to some of the longer-term issues simply because the data is not mature enough yet, and it's that being patient that is challenging. I would say that what has been very surprising to me is how much families know about this therapy when they come in versus other things that we do. This is all over the internet in English and in Spanish, and even families that are less medically sophisticated or educated come in with a pretty good grasp of what this is all about. It's more the uncertainty around the long-term process.
I will just mention, though, that because it came up earlier and you had a good answer to it, but any new treatment like this that offers great hope, the first uptake is among people who are very sophisticated and kind of plugged in a variety of different ways and have the finances to travel or whatever it might be. So I just think that as a system, we need to be sensitive to...
That's what's actually been surprising. I disagree with you, actually, on this. What has been so surprising to me is that because this is in the public media, the first parent that ever asked me about this was a strawberry picker from Salinas who said, can you make these in your lab for my daughter? And that was after the cellular or CLL patients. So it's strikingly different that this is really crossing some of those socioeconomic and education things compared to other therapies. In my experience,
are there too many patients right now? Are you feeling a bottleneck in interest that you have to actually pick some people, or is it you have enough?
I work for a state institution. We take care of everyone, and we try to be agnostic to what their background is, and so that's
right. But I was thinking just in terms of sheer numbers. I don't know if the company, are you having to triage people so that the existing centers aren't overwhelmed? That there's enough capacity to do this right now anywhere?
Right. I mean, I think we've talked about for pediatric ALL, it's really small, right? So we're talking about hundreds of patients a year, not thousands of patients a year. And I've heard a lot about the travel. Novartis actually has a program to support travel for the patient, up to 2 caregivers, travel to and from their home, as well as lodging while they're at the center. So we really are dedicated to that patient access.
Krishna, you wanted to jump in, I think, right?
Yeah, so just jumping back to what are the challenges, the one thing I would say in the adult population, because these patients are so highly refractory, is we have to move very, very quickly, because these are patients who are often deciding between hospice and some multiple third, fourth line therapy, and moving quickly with something that has a lot of logistical barriers. I would jump to the point that our greatest challenge right now in the adult population is the issue with, one, surprisingly, there are some payers, small payers, who are still telling us that this is an experimental therapy, and we have to have a peer-to-peer medical discussion. Amazingly, telling people it's not the case.
Not us.
Not us. Not Anthem. Certainly not the Kaisers. Right. But that's surprising to us. But the bigger problem is really the elephant in the room for us, especially with diffuse large B-cell lymphomas, is public payer access. Medicaid, Medicare, There just are no reimbursement models right now for inpatient administration, and for many patients who have bulky disease and are older and have comorbidities. And again, these products may differ in terms of when the cytokine release syndrome and neurotoxicity happens. And for us, the fact that a lymphoma DRG pays around $18,000 to $19,000, and even with outliers, we're talking about reimbursement that might be, well under $100,000 when we're talking about a pass-through cost of $373,000. We have a really fundamental problem, and we have patients who, again, have Medicare, straight Medicare, or in some cases straight Medicaid, and we have the only therapy. We appropriately described it as game-changing, and we don't have a reimbursement model that's there, and have met with CMMS and CMMI, and there are no, there's no process, even though many of us are doing advocacy, and I think all of us in the room are probably doing advocacy, but there's no easy fix for this, and so we're spending a good chunk of our weekly clinical meeting where we should be talking about how do we quickly get this person in, and how do we get them through the system with dealing with these financial issues, which are outsized right now, and I hope that that uncertainty, and I think the endorsement of the importance of these technologies by panels like this quickly leads to solutions for those payer access issues.
So I'm kind of saving the dessert for last, and the dessert is going to be payment and pricing, and this will be a very important issue. We invited CMS to come, and they declined for whatever reason it would be, but we have full authority, if you will, to recommend to them that they do certain actions. So we'll talk about that. We'll definitely talk about that. I do want to bridge a tiny bit from what the clinical experts are thinking to what I'm sure the payers are starting to try to also assess, which is, wow, there's a lot of uncertainty about this, as you really well laid out, in conjunction with stem cell transplant, before it, after it. Clofarabine, I mean, do you have to try? Should you try clofarabine and fail it before doing CAR T? Is there already clinical expert pressure building, if you will, to move it earlier in treatment, ahead of the FDA labeling at this point? So from your perspectives, where do you both, kind of in your own institutions, but even what you hear elsewhere, what are some of the considerations about how this will be and maybe should be integrated into existing treatment algorithms for patients at this point? And,
well,
and I'm not going to give you 2 hours to answer
no,
this.
The first thing is,
even though you probably need it. But
I'm a fierce advocate. I think of we should not have a slippery slope in off-label use for these technologies because, again, the evidence is strong, but for limited subsets of patient populations. And I think our payer colleagues with whom we've been working, I think are in agreement that these are highly deserving patients and the data are there for these groups of patients, and we should wait for other data before we apply it in an off-label way, as is routine in other circumstances. So I think that's an important thing. We have to work in consensus to make sure that we're doing things in the appropriate setting, and I think trials are necessary in the earlier setting, and we should all support those trials and not, I think, destroy our ability to answer those questions by, a slippery slope of application.
And I think from a manufacturer perspective, we would 100% agree with that we need the ongoing trials to inform other indications, and the indication should not come before those trials.
Right. So, please, Rocio, yeah.
Oops, sorry. I would agree as well. I think for us, it's really important when we go out and educate the physicians to really educate them on the prescribing information and who the appropriate patients are. So that's definitely really key with us. And, working even with the payers, it's something that we stress to them as well.
So I was going to ask you, Jen. Yeah. So how do you guys work with the clinical experts when there's such a maelstrom around the possible? I mean, one option from an insurer would be to say, we cover it. We let the clinical experts in our network decide how it fits into the care for patients. Another approach would be, we're going to work with them to create some treatment or care pathways that would require certain things to be done first before, so what approach are you taking?
So, I mean, I'll just say so that with United Healthcare, just to kind of provide context, we had a work group across our organization that started working on this probably a year ago. So this is not something that kind of happens quickly, and it was it was a large cross-functional group that put these processes in place. So I think, that's one thing, and, we're hearing about how CMS is struggling. I think, it's required us a lot of resources and thought and people's time to develop this. So our current process is that we have coverage according to the FDA label. We are providing coverage through our transplant benefit. So it gets reviewed the way we would review a request for a transplant, and those services are provided through our centers of excellence that are accredited based on their clinical outcomes for transplant, and then with this would be CAR-T as part of that process. I think that's important for several reasons. Some of it has to do with the value discussion, which we'll get into later, but I think even more important is the issue of ensuring quality of the services, and then also helping to address this issue of kind of creeping outside of the areas, not necessarily of the FDA label, because I assume pretty quickly we'll get evidence that might not be submitted to the FDA, right, but that will be evidence of benefit in other populations. But at the centers of excellence where they're providing the alternative therapies like transplant, we have some assurance that there's going to be recognition of the equipoise, and if someone's a candidate for an allogeneic transplant, for example, that's a known curative therapy, that there won't be a jump to offer CAR-T before there's evidence that it's equivalent or better than the allogeneic transplant.
Anything, clinical experts, does that make you?
I completely agree. I think, these are the challenges.
So just to be clear, from an insurer perspective, it sounds like you're not getting down into the weeds of yourself creating some kind of almost guideline for the use of this in conjunction with stem cell transplants. You're letting that come to you. And as long as it's within the FDA label, you're not trying to say this should be used before, and if it's used, you shouldn't do stem cell to consolidate, or you're not.
The FDA label is pretty clear on, so I think, someone can correct me if I'm misquoting, but for the lymphoma indications, it's indicated after failure of 2 prior therapies. Right. So we don't get into what the prior therapies are. It's, they have to meet those criteria. For acute leukemia, there's similar kind of clear indications. I mean, there are, I would say kind of the one area that we've, I guess, seen, and we've been in discussions with some of the professional societies and the organizations, encouraging them to write guidelines right. to help with this process, because I think as we do start to get more evidence and, regarding off-label indications, and there are going to be kind of gray areas where you want expert consensus to kind of help draw those lines. One area that's already come up is the issue of minimal residual disease, and if someone has residual disease, are they now a candidate for CAR-T, or should they be, truly refractory, kind of using older definitions, sort of where do you draw the line? And of course, especially when it's a child, that's a very difficult decision to make, to not offer them the opportunity of a cure if they aren't clearly cured by current standards, even if it's an evolving standard.
Right. So let me make sure and be sensitive to John, who's hovering over us.
Hi, John.
Hello, John, again. John, any response from your perspective in terms of kind of best practices and how you think the evidence around CAR-T should be kind of marshaled at this point into early coverage decisions, and how you work with clinical experts in that way?
Yeah, I just want to echo much of the same comments that Dr. Malin has made, which is this is something that's been on our radar screen since mid-2015 when the 2 items presented at the ASCO meeting, checkpoint inhibitors, PD-1 agents, and CAR-T commanded the most attention. It's been tracking that ever since. And so really, my comments are much the same as what Dr. Malin's made, in that we do not get into clinicians' way in terms of dictating how the therapy is administered, as long as within the bounds of FDA approved indication. And so, and we continue to monitor and consult with our clinical experts. We share the same quality concern that Jan has mentioned. And only because there's still so much that's unknown about even short-term and then obviously longer-term adverse effects potentially and realistically.
Okay. We're having a tiny bit of difficulty hearing you through our speaker system, but you're coming through in the main very well. But if anybody really needs him to repeat something, I will ask John. Yes.
I just want to make a quick comment about process. Through the National Merit Donor Program, Be the Match, we've actually had a very tight interaction in a financial working group, including really representatives of all of the leading payers. And the ASBMT has also, in the last year and a half, been working closely. And we had a Quality Value Cell Therapy Forum, which included payer advocates for patients, a number of, most of the large payers in the country, most of our cell therapy manufacturers who are here and are in the product pipeline, academicians. And so we've been working closely, obviously mindful, as in this setting, of conflicts and overlapping areas of interest on these issues and trying to define how we might, again, as we are here, define quality and value and help to work on processes for indication. And for example, Rocio and I and others are working as part of an MIT Sloan think tank on these issues. So there is a lot of actually appropriate crosstalk. And again, for none of us, we were working on these issues long before these, appropriate and we're happy to say approvals came along. So.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of work obviously went into thinking ahead of time about, introducing this, covering it, paying for it, and yet we're still having lots of problems in the hospitals working this out. And you say it's the public payers that's the biggest problem right now, and maybe smaller regional payers perhaps. Denise, your company, really hit the media pretty hard by working with CMS in advance, looking at different kinds of outcomes-based approaches, talking about indication-specific pricing for the future. We'll talk all about that. Where has that gone well and provided positive lessons for the future, and where are we still stumbling and learning our way? Because it feels like there's still some switches that haven't been thrown or that no one knows which switches to throw. We've got patients who want this treatment who are apparently still not able to get it because the payment mechanisms haven't been fleshed out yet.
Right. Well, and I think with any launch, there's that time frame for different payers are quicker or slower in terms of making the decisions. And yes, we've publicly shared that we've had a number of discussions with CMS. Those discussions are ongoing. And we've had discussions with a lot of payers. So I think similarly, Novartis was out ahead talking to the payers as well. There are, this is an area that really does provide some opportunities for innovation, such as indication-specific pricing and other ways of reimbursing. We've continued to have those discussions with payers as well as CMS. And I think we are making progress, but those conversations are still in the deliberative phase. And Steve, we've had discussions at some of the methods workshops, right? That right now, the way that CMS reimburses is on a per patient basis, right? For a product, and there are some barriers to indication-specific pricing.
Right.
So we're continuing to have those discussions. Our second product is under FDA review, as you saw from the data is not as mature as the KITE data at this point in time, as we're having still in discussions and deliberations, and we're continuing to have those discussions. I think that some of those the CMS, so there's Medicare and then there's Medicaid, right? And a lot of those decisions are made at the state level, right? So that's, I think, and you alluded to that, right, in terms of the state and the regional, and a lot of it is education. And, it's being a new innovative therapy, as you had mentioned, we spent a lot of our time, with the education that we can compliantly do before approval, and then, right. That's our force field is out there continuing to educate the centers as well as the payers.
So is this partly real quick follow-up. Is this partly a problem of the 6-month hold that some payers will put on new technologies, complex or sometimes very expensive or sometimes both, go into a different channel sometimes that can just slow things down? Is that part of what's happening, or are we talking about other payment mechanism problems at the state Medicaid level that CMS just hasn't figured out?
Exactly. I think it's very heterogeneous, right? So,
both?
We've heard, it's both. I think we've heard about some payers who were out and having those discussions, right? And then there's we heard this word a lot today, right? The uncertainty, right? So from a payer perspective, and from a company perspective, we can't develop that real world evidence ahead of the launch, right? Because the real world evidence is after approval. So that real world evidence that informs a lot of our discussions with payers in terms of what is this going to cost? What is this going to look like, right? We're early days. We're dedicated to continue to gather that information. But you can't have that information before approval.
And Rocio, did you want, I'm sorry, I think I cut you off earlier too. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, definitely. So one of the things I want to just clarify, Medicare is providing coverage for Yescarta. The concerns that we're hearing, though, from the hospitals is about the lack of additional payment when any CAR-T is administered in the inpatient setting. For us, I think it's important to note that this is not specific to CAR-T. It's really with any new technology, any new drug that's administered while the patient is hospitalized. It is an important concern to us as well. And we'll definitely continue to work with CMS to find innovative ways to enhance reimbursement, in particular for those new technologies such as Yescarta. We did apply for the new technology add-on payment, so if approved, the hospitals will receive up to 50% of the cost of the therapy on top of the DRG.
So help us be as...
I was going to say, once again, from as you think about a system approach, right? You can, so there could be, you can only apply as you're getting close to approval or you're approved, right? So as much as, once again, as a company, you might want to get ahead of that, right? So that you're answering those health system questions and it's in place. There isn't the bandwidth for those to be approved until we are also at approval for the product.
So help us be... Sorry, Jen, let me let you go, and then I have another question. Go ahead.
I think, I think part of the barriers that you're seeing from the, or the challenges that you're seeing from the public system actually reflects the budget impact. And that you wouldn't be having these issues if they weren't coming at such a high price tag. Because, for individual states, they're deciding kind of, well, when do we have to cover this? And we haven't factored it into this year's budget. Same, and then as that translates then to health plans, it wasn't factored into the bid that they put into Medicare, say, for this year, or to the state plan. So there's a kind of a short-term as well as a long-term budget impact that I think is influencing some of the short-term challenges here to access.
So let's try to be clear, especially since CMS is not here at the table. Is this a problem of their having the mechanisms to make this all work and just going slow and finding reasons to take a long time because they're worried about the new budget impact or other things? Or are there really a lack of a way for them to figure out how to pay for this because it's so expensive or so new? There's some mechanism problem, or there's literally just the mechanisms right there. They're just taking a long time to get there. Which is it?
So from an advocacy standpoint, one thing I would say in our relationship with payers that really know centers of excellence in transplantation and other cell therapies, again, Optum being a good example of somebody who's led innovation in this field, is that they are not prescriptive about how we deliver a therapy. They rely on centers of excellence to do this in the appropriate setting. If we think we can do an auto transplant in the outpatient setting or should do it in the allogeneic transplant setting, they allow this. One of the problems right now is that, and again, ASPMT has met with Medicare, I think 8 times and written 6 comment letters so far, is that there is a process that works in the outpatient setting and a process that doesn't exist in the inpatient setting. And our feeling is not that these therapies should or should not be delivered in one place or another, but that the right clinician looking at this patient with the right issues should be able to make a decision. And patient advocates should demand that their clinician get the appropriate reimbursement and not have a perverse incentive to do it one way or another. And it turns out that in the Medicare setting, you have different rules. You have an inpatient rule and you have an outpatient rule, and they get decided separately with different comment periods and their natural lag times. So I don't think when we've met with the chief medical officer of CMMI that they do understand and they're sympathetic to these issues, but the processes are not quick and are not easy to fix. So we think that patients should demand and that clinicians appropriately deliver the therapy in the way that we think it's sustainable, cost-effective, but most importantly, going to have the highest likelihood of success and safety, right? And we shouldn't be pushed by an inpatient rule or an outpatient rule or different reimbursement to make those decisions. That is ultimately the disinterest of the patient.
That's the major frustration, I think, from my perspective, and the thing that has been the biggest barrier to this. You can't do things until it's approved, and then once it's approved, we had a couple of kids who needed therapy right away, and the first question I got was that, well, our contracts are we have 90 days to renegotiate this. I'm like, in 90 days, can we wait that long? I'm like, 90 days, this is acute leukemia, this child will be dead. And so I think that's one challenge. The other challenge is that, all of our patients have had different payers, and depending on the payer, the reimbursement is vastly different if it's in the inpatient setting or the outpatient setting, and it's reversed. So you have to ask and double check for every single payer. So sometimes we will only get full reimbursement if it's an inpatient setting, and sometimes we only get full reimbursement if it's an outpatient setting. And our in and outpatient setting are in the same building, hooked by a long hallway, which is crazy. But that's the reality, and that's the systems problem that I think really needs to be addressed.
Kim and Emily, you think patients should hear all about this or nothing about this?
So I was just thinking, I understand from a hospital standpoint, I'm a nurse at a university hospital in Madison. I ironically do the collections for these kids and these patients. That's what I do for a living. So from that standpoint, I get, and understand, people got to make money. It's a business. And my hospital right now is feeling that impact with, CMS and reimbursement and that kind of stuff. From a parent standpoint, obviously, it's crazy to me to have these conversations because the only thing that matters is, my child living. And unfortunately, I've seen kids that have been collected and have died before they've gotten to go for manufacturing of cells and going to therapy. And I now, in hindsight, after my son went through it and then, being involved in the collections, timing is of the essence with, from the time that, we found out Austin had MRD positive, we collected right away. If he would have had chemotherapy, it would have impacted the collection, and he might not have gotten to manufacturing and to where we are today. So timing is of the essence, and I believe, honestly, if we didn't have what we did, Austin wouldn't be here today. And to have to deal, I feel really bad that you guys, I'm thankful for our doctor that, now in hindsight, I know what he had to do in order to get this approved. And, thankfully I have great insurance, but that's not the case, for everybody, obviously. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I can't really add much to it because I would just second everything you said there.
Thanks. John Yao on the phone. Is early dialogue the answer to a lot of this? Could it be improved, enhanced? It sounds like the companies have been eager to try to have that dialogue. What worked well and what didn't? I'm not sure if Anthem was part of early dialogue on these treatments, but what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think early dialogue in the case of CAR T is definitely essential. I think payers in a very difficult position because on one hand, I think payers want to embrace new treatment modality that may very well be a game changer, and the early promise of CAR T certainly is out there. On the other hand, there's so much uncertainty, and we worry about sustainability as well as affordability of the treatment. And what should be emphasized is that really the payment model or the payment strategy, methodology, really has to be individualized and customized. So for instance, the approach to CAR-T is very different than the approach to the first gene replacement therapy for Relabeling for RPE65 mutation, because the treatment methodology and the delivery model is so different. In the case of CAR-T, I think early dialogue really was a must, because there's so many different moving parts, right? Beginning with the evaluation of the patient involved, whether or not he or she would be a candidate, what kind of refractory disease, to the leukapheresis process, and then in between, something else may happen. The patient might not have survived, as has been pointed out. So it makes the payment methodology, I think, that much more challenging. If you think about, the traditional fee-for-service model, first trying to come up with a, share risk model with bundled services, for instance, versus, other mechanisms that's value-based, is very difficult because they're literally 4 or 5 distinctly separate yet continuous clinical steps, during which at any given point things could change. So in addition to clinical uncertainty, there's also a great deal of payment uncertainty or reimbursement uncertainty because of all of those parts. And you have hospital costs versus professional costs, which typically is not the case, for instance, when I was making a comparison to Relabeling as a gene replacement therapy.
All right, thanks. Real quickly, Denise, I'm going to come back to you and Novartis' experience, but I just wonder, do manufacturers ever think of hosting a website of best practices by insurance companies covering our product?
I don't think we could do that.
Maybe patient groups or clinical
Maybe there's
groups.
someplace else that could be posted.
Well, I mean, we hope our reports, in a sense, can both discuss and share some elements of best practice around how to consider coverage and different options. But it's just, as a resource, I'm sure it would be helpful for many plans to have a place to learn from how other plans are doing it. You're right, it can't be collusion, or I hate to use that word, but it can't be anything else like that. So, Denise, Novartis, CMS, outcomes-based agreement. 1 month, if the patient isn't in complete or total remission, at 1 month, the payment isn't made. So it's not like they have to refund, it's just they wait for a month and then...
It's not billed, right?
It's not billed
until after
until
the
after
decision at 1 month. And then it's only billed if there's demonstration of complete response.
Right. So devil's advocate, obviously this is one small step for man in terms of outcomes-based agreements, but is it a giant leap for mankind? Because at a month, we really know what to expect. The key hinge of uncertainty here, 1 year, 2 years, is where you saw this panel and every doctor and every group kind of wrestling. So why not just go out to 1 year and say, either no payment for a year until it works, or we'll pay you back if it doesn't at a year. Or 2, hinging it where the uncertainty is most critical. Why not?
Because we have restrictions around how we can develop our outcomes-based contracting. So because outcomes-based contracting can be seen as something that is promotional, we need to maintain an outcomes-based contract that is consistent with our label, and our label has complete response at 1 month. In addition, and I think this applies not just to the Kymriah outcomes-based contract, but as a manufacturer, when we think about what does an outcomes-based contract look like for fill-in-the-blank X product, right? It needs to be something that is measurable. Mm-hmm. It needs to be something that is consistently measurable at about the same time or within some reasonable confidence interval in the real world. So as we, and I think as we all know, the information that is collected outside of a clinical trial and sitting in electronic medical records or patient records at clinics are generally not the same as the endpoints that are measured, and they're not measured in the same way as the endpoints in a clinical trial. So we have to balance all of that, and in this case, we know that complete response at 30 days is something that is a standard of practice in pediatric ALL. So we felt that we would have a greater likelihood that that data would be available. The implementation of this is not simple, right? So, from a Novartis perspective, it took a village in terms of across all of our different functions and experts. And then when you get to the clinic side, there's also ensuring that they're collecting that data has to be communicated in a confidential way. We have to communicate the information to the payer in a confidential way. In this case, the outcomes-based contract is with the center and not with the payer, and that allows the opportunity across payers for those payers to benefit from the outcomes-based contract, and it's only, and then it is only with the approved center. So we have 33 centers at this point for PEDS ALL, and those centers are all candidates to engage in the outcomes-based contract with us. But it really is that balance of, because it is promotional, it has to be consistent with label, and what is feasible to collect so that we can measure the outcome.
So let me gently push to see if there's a weakness to that argument, because if we can only do outcomes-based agreements on the letter of the FDA label, it will just hamstring the whole effort. And there are lots of other people who have suggested that we should be doing these, again, further downstream. The Virata treatment for childhood blindness has at least one agreement that's many months downstream. Jen, if you are thinking about this beforehand through early dialogue, did it cross your mind this promotional aspect, is it a non-starter for a private insurer to consider creating an outcomes-based agreement, at least with rebates or something else that would link to a longer-term horizon?
I don't think that, from a payer standpoint, I don't think we feel that the outcome has to be something that's specifically in the label. I think, in an ideal world, we would like the most clinically meaningful outcome. But I think to Denise's point, the outcome has to be measurable, and it has to be something that everyone can agree is measurable. And, so that is an advantage of the...
How about if they're alive at 2 years?
Well, but I think you get...
I can measure that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I think, there's you get into issues of loss to fall. They're still tracking people, and then there's the reality of, at least from a private insurance standpoint, but even I think with some of the public payers, people move, right? And people aren't necessarily with our plan in a different calendar year. So there's a lot of kind of nuances to that. So yes, is 1 month, is the CR at 1 month kind of the ideal clinical outcome? Probably not. But is it a first step for mankind? I think it's a very good first step. Very small. I would say it's more than a small step. It's a big step.
Well, it felt like a big step in the policy community to have CMS start to speak this language.
Right.
The private insurers have been thinking about it, talking about it, and working with manufacturers around the concepts for a longer time. So
there's a lot of nuance to it, right? In terms of how because of the pricing system through, or reimbursement system through CMS that also most private payers use as well, right, is tied around average sales price. And so, finding ways that these models don't necessarily influence that in a way that really disincentivizes the manufacturers to enter into these contracts has actually been another challenge.
Yeah.
A little reality check, though. So for over a decade, we have had federally mandated outcomes reporting. Again, there are 9,000 allogeneic transplants done in the United States last year, all highly complex things that are very, and I can tell you, and we submit thousands of data points on forms that are mandated before, during, and after transplant, and if I fall one standard deviation outside of, Jen, I'm not going to pick on you, but your, your requirements, I'm going to fall out of center of excellence, and my number of transplants is going to drop in half. So and that's a 1-year risk-adjusted disease-associated survival. So we do it, and I'm held to that regardless of whether a patient moves and regardless of whether they have good socioeconomics or live under a bridge or whatever else, right? So it can be done, and it is done now, and you certainly are not going to keep me in network unless I do that now, and the federal government holds me to it. So there are precedents. I don't want to say, and I do think it's really important that Novartis took this step. It's not something that we've seen before, but it absolutely can be done for other things other than hematopoietic transplant, where it's already done and federally required.
Mm-hmm. All right, so now we're having fun, right? Now we're having fun. Rocio, I'll come back.
It was just sort of mechanistically, when you say that the center actually charges. So you have a patient, they get the drug, you're keeping track every month, and then there's a nurse or someone in your billing office who says, okay, they've made it, now we can bill you?
Oh, so it's just the one, so it's the 1 month, it's not months, right?
Okay.
As opposed to you're tracking for 1 year. Yeah, so the information is provided to Novartis in terms of the complete response, and if the complete response is, if it's demonstrated, then a bill is generated and sent to the center. And if the response is not demonstrated, then there is no bill that is sent. And that is for patients covered by any insurance. That would include patients covered by Medicare and Medicaid.
Okay, good. So Rocio, I know Kite has talked about outcomes-based agreements, but didn't make it a major part of the launch in terms of your discussions, as far as I know, with Medicare or private payers. Are there from your own perspective, are there certain barriers that are keeping you from wanting to get into that game? Do you view it as what will become the norm for your own kind of approaches, let's say, as the indication spreads? What do you think?
So I think for us, when you, I guess to go off Denise, when you think about value-based outcome contracting, the most important thing is to be able to identify consistent clinical endpoints whereby the target patient population really responds within a defined time frame. When you look at our clinical trials, there were 23 patients who went from partial response or stable disease that converted into a complete response 6 months, some even after 15 months after the infusion. So it kind of made having the consistent clinical endpoints within that defined time period difficult. So our focus has really been at looking at the clinical attributes of our therapy in the context of the existing market. We looked at the value of the innovation, and we did a third-party market research in order to select a price that would support patient access.
All right, good. All right, so let's talk about indication-specific pricing briefly, because it came up in Novartis's discussion with CMS at the beginning. So again, the concept would be we have a price, and in ICER's analysis, the price for Kymriah did align with the clinical gains in this patient population, the pediatric one. So now you've got some results in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There'll be others perhaps. How serious are you about making that a reality? I know we all know the list of things, the best price issues. How critical is it, do you think, though, for the sustainability of this model of innovation and pricing, unless we can get indication-specific pricing, which would, in principle, suggest perhaps a lower price in many other indications, perhaps, where there's not quite the same clinical, kind of revolution and gain that we are assuming here? Are you really prepared to substantially reduce your price in an administrative way, or to relabel it, which has been done by some companies? They literally will relabel the drug for a different indication so that they don't even have to worry about best price. How committed to this idea are you?
So I think the relabeling, if you think about it, it's a bag of cells, so it's administered in the same way.
You can paint the bag a different color, though. You really can. You can.
So I think that is something we haven't considered, is painting the bag a different color. That one. But in all seriousness, Novartis is actually very proud of having launched with a value-based price. We did build a cost effectiveness model that included the clinical efficacy, the patient perspective, societal perspective, as well as the health system perspective. And we're dedicated to doing that for not only Kymriah and Peds ALL, but for other potential indications that we might be approved for. So we have continued to have those discussions with payers and with CMS, and are continuing to look at the availability for a feasible path forward to do that.
Do you think it's fair to state, if we write a final report that says, as a policy recommendation, manufacturers bringing very expensive new products to market, especially in ultra-orphan or orphan conditions to begin with, should commit publicly to indication-specific pricing if their labels expand?
I think that if we can find a policy path forward where we, so I think Jen raised the best price issue. So there are policy, right?
Yes.
So, I think once again, Novartis has publicly, and I'm publicly stating today, right, that we are committed to looking at paths forward for indication-specific pricing. It's not entirely our decision, though.
Rocio?
No, I think for us, obviously, Yescarta currently has one indication, and for any future indications, we'll continue working with payers to assure patient access. The way the coding system is currently set up, it is difficult to have one drug with different indications have different codes. So in order to easily facilitate indication-based pricing, it's important that that part of the healthcare system also changes.
All right. Do you think it's fair for people to think that you're going to be making a lot more profit as the indications expand, and therefore the price should just drop on that basis, not even considering whether it's more or less effective in that indication? Let's just assume that it's the same. But now you have, instead of a couple thousand, you've got 200,000, 100,000 patients in the country. Should the price come down when there are more patients to be treated?
I think from Novartis's perspective, we really are looking at a value-based approach to ensuring access for patients. So I think that gets back to more of the indication-specific pricing, that if the sustainability, if you will, for access for patients for novel treatments like this, I think is dependent on that value-based price.
So value-based to you means not worrying about the affordability to the system depending on the sheer number of patients, in other words. Is that fair?
I think there's budget impact, right? So there are different components, but I think as we think about the value of our products, it's based on the value across those four components.
So Rocio, when we looked at Yescarta, our potential budget impact analysis, which always has to have huge assumptions sometimes built into it, but at the current price, we have a certain kind of line that suggests when the budget impact may seem like a big budget impact in the context of the overall health economy kind of spending. And according to our calculations, we could only treat 1 out of 3 eligible patients who could benefit from Yescarta without kind of meeting that line, which is around $1 billion a year of new net budget impact. So we use that line to suggest that policymakers may need to come together to think about whether we stage the introduction or figure out a way to pay for it differently and or reduce the price. So again, kind of a similar question about the tension between the value-based price and the cumulative budget impact as we get the ability to use this for more patients. How do you think the health system should work so that we can keep this affordable and sustainable?
I think one of the important things is to really look beyond simply the cost of the therapy and really look at the health outcome improvements, as well as the societal benefits of what having a patient in a complete response and in some potential cases cure, what that would mean. So I think in order for us to do that, we really need to come together and keep coming together as key stakeholders to have those conversations to determine what the healthcare system should look like to be able to adapt and help patients get access to these type of therapies.
John and then Jen. If you're representing, you're not public payers, but you're private payers, what's your perspective on that? Why don't I let John go first this time, and then Jen can backfill. John?
Yeah, I have a slightly different take, and I'm a little bit troubled because I hear phrases like value-based pricing, thrown around. I hear phrases like performance guarantee thrown around. And I do agree that what Virata did with Medicare is a meaningful first step, but the skeptical side of me really says that if the drug or if the treatment were priced correctly or rightly from my perspective to begin with, so it's $80,000 for the episode treatment or $150,000 for the episode treatment, then there wouldn't need to be this performance guarantee. So it's almost as if the performance guarantee is being used as an alibi to justify that high price. To use an analogy, someone went out and paid, $50,000 for a high definition TV. You would want to have some kind of performance guarantee, right? Whereas if the TV is, $1,000, there wouldn't be a need for that performance guarantee in a way. And also, would someone accept paying, let's say an outrageous amount of money, $20,000 for a TV, and accept a performance guarantee of a month? It'll work well for a month, and then afterwards it could completely, not work anymore. Would someone accept that? So I just find it somewhat troubling in that, from the affordability standpoint, we talk about all of these nice-sounding, phrases and whatnot, catchphrases that we throw up there, but in reality, from the affordability perspective, the consumers, the patients, and the payers always in a reactive position. This happened with Hep C treatment when it affects a large population, a very prevalent disease. This happens again, with orphan or ultra-orphan or near-orphan conditions. It just happens time and again where the consumers and the payers are just being asked to react to a price that is preset and by the company. And really, it takes away a lot of the truly meaningful, discussion in terms of negotiation back and forth. So I said earlier that, for instance, with CAR-T, early dialogue is a must, in my opinion. But case in point is that when we try to engage, when the payer tries to engage the company to begin an early dialogue, usually it's not necessarily well received because almost never, in fact, I would say never, not even almost, would they be willing to come to the table with pricing information or anything. And the standard practice is they always waited till FDA approval or the last minute, but they would never even come to the table with the kind of relevant and essential information. So I'm just a little bit, I'm expressing a lot of my personal views here, but I just want to, in a way, call it like it is, the way that I see it.
All right, thank you. Jen?
So I think this is an interesting situation because the therapies seem to have tremendous value, but yet at a very, very high price. And so one of the issues is affordability and budget impact. And, and from a private payer perspective, in today's dollars, half of an individual, essentially employers and their employees contribute half of the median family income to healthcare at this point. So we're spending a lot on healthcare. So overall budget impact and driving up that cost is, I think, of concern. But I think the other thing that you've heard today is the issue of what's a reasonable profit, right? Mm-hmm. So even if it's good value, is it still reasonable to expect so much profit, both from the manufacturer standpoint and then the part we haven't touched on, other than the uncertainty around it, is the hospital markup of therapies, right? So, and there's a lot of variability with that. The average markup for infused therapies in a hospital is 100%, but there's wide variation around that. We had a case recently of another new therapy for acute leukemia where we got a call we got an email, actually, not a call, from someone in the claims department because the bill came in at $1 million. And it was recently approved, so we didn't really know what the price was. So we had someone in our pharmacy department look up what the WAC would have been for the 3 units that were billed, and WAC was $50,000. And so we contacted the hospital to say, well, was this a mistake? Maybe someone just typed in a couple of extra zeros. No, it was not a mistake. And we've contacted the CFO of the hospital to consider them, and this is, in this particular case, it's a self-insured employer that's not a large employer that's going to be paying this cost. So these are, there's another potential disparity here from the standpoint that you end up with cancer patients who are particularly vulnerable population, then paying, through the margin on therapies, basically subsidizing the cost for others within the healthcare system or the hospital because they're paying such a huge markup depending on what their own out-of-pocket costs are. Right. So I think profit from the standpoint of what's a reasonable profit for a hospital, what's a reasonable profit for a manufacturer, what's a reasonable profit for a health plan, although at this point our profits are maybe probably more regulated than some of the other stakeholders in the industry at this point.
So real quickly, what do you think if there's a policy recommendation around the markup issue? Should it just be to highlight that this bears attention between providers and payers, or is there a best practice? It should be no more than X, or what would you suggest?
I think as a matter of policy, I think we should move away from percent markups on drugs. I think that there should be essentially that we should separate the idea that we're paying for services that need to be delivered for complex patients by marking up therapies. I think that there should be an administration cost and then we should pay for the therapies, which is what we're doing. We're at United Healthcare, we have a relationship with these centers of excellence. We're in partnership already for many years in our transplant programs. And so we've been negotiating for the services that they provide for those patients and not basically paying a high markup on the therapy to pay for those services.
Okay. Yes, Christian.
Yeah, just one adjunct to that, and I think that...
You want the $1 million?
Not profit, right? So we can't make profit in academic centers, right? So one of the issues is that, again, these Medicare rules right now, if it's a DRG based and it's a lymphoma DRG based and it's an outlier payment that's there, and we are, again, well short of, again, the cost of the acquisition, and, in some cases, how you charge that product and the charge to cost ratio drives reimbursement, and that should not be the case. Right. No one thinks that you should have to put an inflated charge for a product on your charge master to get inadequate reimbursement to begin with that doesn't even cover your costs. And then now you have to justify this to everyone. And so we should, again, I would say, decrease the disincentives to create structures that are really not reflective of what we want. I think we should, whether it's capitated payments or other approaches, we should treat the patient in the inpatient setting if they should be treated in the inpatient setting, or in the outpatient setting if it's safe and can be done with that product. Yeah. And we shouldn't create these perverse incentives to do the wrong thing, right?
And I think that's a difference actually from the private payer world than from CMS. So, we contract with the transplant centers on a case rate for transplants and for CAR-T that is irrespective of where they're treated. So if the product is infused outpatient or inpatient, from our standpoint, it makes no difference.
And there's no pretend charge we can put on our charge master to get more from you.
Right, because it's for the service, which is the ideal, right? Because you want want the decision about where the patient gets treated to be based on both the clinical situation for that patient, but the reality is different centers may have different systems in place in order to monitor the patient. Right. So if they infuse them as an outpatient, you need to have the systems in place to be able to get them into the hospital quickly, and you don't want them to be putting patients at risk because of their financial situation.
And two other things. One, we have skin in the game.
Right.
So if we put the patient in the hospital longer to achieve the same outcome, that hurts us. And the second thing is, because of, again, federally mandated data reporting that's risk-adjusted and one-year survival-oriented, they don't have to do the enforcement that's already done, and they can just evaluate that externally. So I think and we're fact accredited, which drives the standard. So there's a lot that's actually, fortunately, these networks don't have to really worry about, because we're doing in a very forward way, dealing with accreditation, dealing with quality reporting, and are incentivized to create sustainability as opposed to maximize, charges, for example. We want to maximize outcomes for the patient.
All right. So I promised, told David Mitchell on the phone earlier that his 3 points would come up in the policy roundtable. Alex raised them as well. We've talked about the size of the population and its relative, kind of effect on what the price, how we think about affordability. We've talked, Jen raised the question of profits and how much profit, and this is what David said. Do we think a bit about what value means in terms of what's necessary to sustain innovation? And one way to look at that is how it could influence profit margins, either in the short term or long term. The third piece, it's almost like instead of indication-specific pricing, should we vary the price in relation to the taxpayer investment and the basic science that went into it? The amount of risk held by the public through NIH research when it gets passed off to a company. David obviously feels, and his group has been strongly in favor of saying there's a piece missing when we talk about pricing and value, and that's where, like, the history, the provenance of this drug, and the amount that the American public has already put into it. So let me start this time with the payers and then work backwards. Or actually, I don't know whom to ask first because this is a real public policy question. So maybe I will start with the manufacturers. You've heard this argument. Does it resonate at all?
We have heard this argument. I think I don't want to get into the details of whether the number is correct or, because then we could have another 2-hour conversation. I think there was actually another article about a week after David's article that highlighted that the NIH investments actually go across different sectors and are to spur innovation with the thought that once there is something that is that has some promise, that a manufacturer, whether that be a manufacturer for pharmaceutical manufacturer like the two of us, or if it's in another industry, that company then takes it, moves it forward with the large investments that come to developing a manufacturing plant, to the scalability for the quality of the product that needs to be created, that needs to be insured patient after patient after patient after patient, which isn't happening with that NIH investment. It's the, if you will, it's the proof of concept or the pilot study that then allows the manufacturers to move forward. And that investment includes a manufacturing plant that meets the quality standards for regulatory approval, right, which is not being subsidized by the NIH.
All right.
So I actually think it is an example of public and private resources bringing innovative therapies forward.
All right. Now I know David would be having a heart attack if he were in some way. We're close to actually trying to wrap this up and inviting people to make kind of concluding statements. But I would like to, on this particular point, because it is kind of an issue of public perspective and policy, does anybody from the CTAF at this point, either on this topic, sorry, not the audience, I know you would love to also, but anybody on the CTAF panel, would you like to either comment on this issue or raise a specific question for the policy roundtable before we move into concluding statements? Mike?
So I will comment on this issue. There has been with time, an asymmetry around this issue, with the vast majority of the profit ending up maybe not with the inventor, but with the folks that operationalize it, which is why many academic institutions are installing their own GMP labs, because they realize that to continue to support what academic mission and with declining NIH funding, they need a way to fund that. If there was a better, or at least better parity and partnership, those types of competitive environment things would maybe not happen.
Okay. Bob?
The term that's missing here is intellectual property. Academic centers have learned to try and guard their IP. And, you know, on the flip side of it, most patients actually would refer to that as the patent. That's, you know, I don't appreciate the dancing around what we're really talking about here. I understand the investment in the manufacturing and everything else, but the development of the IP was the really hard part. That's where the real risk actually really is. And to say that we're not getting our money's worth from manufacturers, I think, is actually pretty much a given point in a lot of people's minds right now. I'm loaded for bear about half a page here that I could go with real easy that goes to part of this. But, you know, along with this, I'd like to throw out that you guys got off real easy on this. I don't think FDA, I think the people that need to be here is FDA. We need to be holding their feet to the fire, because a single-arm trial doesn't exist. That's an observational study. We gave these people a drug, we gave them treatment, and we watched what happened. That's not a trial. We ran phase 1/2-ish. We don't really have a big distinction in these damn things, and phase 3 is apparently not going to exist. Every other CAR T manufacturer from now till doomsday is going to expect the same deal. You didn't have to spend anything for the control arms in an RCT. You know, you didn't have to spend money at all on a phase 3 trial. I want some of that money back. I want that money reinvested in the data that I don't have to answer these questions that I had here today. I don't want it just collected. I want you guys to develop it. The questions that we posed here today that we need answers to, I want you all to go out and find. I really don't care how you do it right now, because clearly the horse has already left the barn. So if we're going to reinvent stuff, let's come up with something brand new here. And the idea that we're going to eliminate phase 3s and just go straight to treatment, we got to do something better for the end result here. We can't answer the questions that we want to answer here. That was clear. It seems to be clear to everybody that's never seen us do anything before. The heartburn on our end is really profound. You know, Novartis had to go to ODAC with this. The vote was 10-0, which fries my brain. There were good comments in the transcript from that, but apparently Kite didn't have to go to ODAC. You know, this doesn't bode well for the future of CAR T therapies, except for the companies that are developing the next ones along the line.
All right. So I know that there are several people who might want to continue commenting. What I'm going to do is ask you to think about how to wrap that into a very brief concluding statement. That was not Bob's concluding statement. That was, but I want to invite our policy roundtable to do this first. What we frequently ask is for you to identify the one take-home point that you think should be highlighted in our final report. It can be anything from an early issue with the evidence, often though it's around the policy, and you can also think of it as a request. If you had the ability to request one thing of one stakeholder, or even a couple, that would make our future ability to achieve that goal of sustainable access to high-value care really possible in this area, what would that request be? What would you ask? Bob just made a request, for instance. What would your request be of anybody at this table or not at this table? So let me start with the patients. And I've also asked people to try to do it in one sentence. Commas are all right. Semicolons,
All I'm going to say is put yourself in the patient's shoes and think about how you would feel if you had 6 months to live, if your child had no options left. And I know that we get very focused on the kids, but I'm 32. Well, I'm 36 now, but I was 32 with 3 little kids. Think about that when you're concerned about the phase 3 that didn't happen. We need these approved to save lives. That's what's happening.
Okay, thank you. Kim?
It seems to me, you know, a lot of the question is this worth it? And I wholeheartedly believe this was 100% worth it for my family, for my son, because I get to see him every day, and I get to hear him tell me how much he loves me, and I get to see him open his eyes every day. And so that's worth it to me.
Thanks. Michelle?
That's hard to follow, but I would say that to me this feels like a game-changing opportunity for our patients. I don't like going to funerals, and being able to help kids get to the next place in life and grow up. You know, we have no idea who's going to be the next great thing, and that's the joy of this. I do wish we had a crystal ball to know answers to the things that we're not clear about now in terms of the long-term stuff.
So I think when our patients and our children get these diseases, we want payers to make sure that the clinicians can do what's in the best interest of the patient with respect to success and quality in a sustainable way, but that we're not perversely made to make decisions, allowed or forced to make decisions because of these vagaries of payment policy. I think if we can have the policies reflect what's right for the patient in the right setting for the right product, that's what we need.
Thank you. Denise?
And I think I would add to that I would, and it's something that I know Novartis is continuing to dialogue on, I'm sure Kite is as well, that we continue to talk about innovative payment models that allow us to have a value-based price, that allow us to continue to innovate and to do that in a sustainable way for the healthcare system.
Okay. Rocio?
You know, I think it's important to remember that 3 years ago, a patient with relapse refractory DLBCL had on average 6 months to live, which makes therapies like Yescarta an important new treatment options for these patients. And I think it's important to continue to keep coming together as key stakeholders and having more of these conversations in order to ensure that patients have access to these therapies.
Thank you. Jen?
I'll just talk about the future. I mean, I think we're all excited about the innovation and the promise that these therapies bring. I think the issue is how are they going to be disseminated, and how are we going to ensure that the evidence is there to support dissemination in other indications, and are they going to truly have the same value for those indications? And it's certainly possible that there'll be greater value there. I don't discount that, but I think making sure that the value is really there and that we're not taxing the healthcare system further.
Thank you. John, would you like to make a final statement?
Yeah, same thought. Affordability, what that really means to everyone, and I like to see more risk share, both upside and downside, to the manufacturer as well as the provider.
All right, thank you. Okay, CTAF, same charge. You guys did a great job of being brief. I appreciate it. So if we could go through, and we'll end with the chair. Your takeaway point, something that you really, or a request of the system, something going forward.
I guess I would just say that I think that this is really exciting science, and I get the sense that we're pushing the envelope. But I'd like to encourage that we push the envelope with the data collection too, especially with regard to the long-term implications and the survival data, and the reproductive risks as well.
Thanks. Alex?
Our society is at a tweener phase. We are just beginning to be mature enough to, at the beginnings of maturity, to have a national dialogue about the ethics of how much profit is enough and how much profit is too much, given the investment of society and taxpayers in this research.
Thank you. Mike?
I made some notes during the roundtable. This has been a particularly interesting and challenging discussion as we look at this emerging therapy, and particularly when this has the feel to some or the absolute nature of a breakthrough kind of therapy. I think we need to be aware that this is not how it's going to end up. It's going to be used differently. They'll figure out how to modulate the drug so it won't have its complications. It will be inserted elsewhere, and it will have more utility, but a lot more use, potentially a lot more total cost to the system, even at the cost of the drug, these drugs or this treatment. goes down. And this will have a significant effect on cost and raise a lot of policy questions. To Bob's point that, you know, we picked on the drug companies a lot, but I want to ask the question, not looking for an answer, but there's a payer role in this, and CMS in some ways has stepped up with coverage, with evidence, and I think it's really high time that the commercial insurance industry takes their role or meets their social contract to be part of this, rather than set up a set of rules and structure and to say, well, gee, you haven't developed the evidence. I think they need to be part of that evidence and to meet their social contract.
All right, thank you. Jeff.
One of the lessons I learned today is that it's hard to make a silk purse cost-effectiveness analysis from a single-arm study, and it makes it very difficult to do smart shopping at a population level when you don't know what you're going to get and what it's going to cost.
Thank you. Pat.
I just want to explain my votes today because I was thinking about our last session, which we focused on things like Tai Chi, and I voted for net health benefit with, you know, kind of sketchy evidence. But I think the nature of this drug and the cost of it factored into my decision to have a higher standard on the evidence. And so we didn't have a vote for promising but inconclusive. That really was my vote. You know, my father died from ALL, and my best friend just finished chemo. So I'm very enthusiastic about the opportunity here. But at the same time, my key message is to elevate the information on which we're basing these decisions, given the cost and given the implications of how widespread they're going to be. And just a suggestion for ICER is to maybe find out when other studies are forthcoming. I heard from Kite that the Zuma study will be published with 2 years worth of data in December. So maybe if we wait 6 months or a year, we would have a different response to the information because it'd be more robust.
Thank you. Joy?
So I agree with Pat in the sense that I think that this is very promising, exciting therapy with very high uncertainty about what happens after 3 to 4 months. And the only way to lower that uncertainty is to get more data. And the way for that to happen in the most useful way is if everyone gets together. This is the part that's fantasy for me. So I would really like to see the manufacturers, the people delivering this, and the health plans, and the regulators, so payers, regulators, manufacturers, and providers, get together to collect data on all these people, right? All these people who are at the end of the line, because not all of them are going to be able to access this breakthrough therapy. So we could get contemporaneous outcomes. It won't be a randomized controlled trial, but it'll be better than what we've got now. And we could do it for a lot longer with more people than what we've got now, because the data gets very thin after 6 months. And I would like to feel more certainty about this exciting new therapy, and that's the way to do it.
Thanks a lot. Bill?
I think what resonates with me was something that Joy just said. These are patients that are at the end of their line. I know what that feels like. I've been there a number of times as a double transplant recipient. When the science shows the effectiveness to get the result that will change that, it's something we need to look at the business plans that are out there that can embrace that so we can get it to the people. And I think sometimes what we found is that the business plans we're working with are restrictive. They take time, and somebody at the end of the line doesn't have that time. So it comes down to us getting together and the stakeholders getting together, manufacturers, the payers, the patients, and looking at perhaps new solutions, because if the old solutions aren't working, we're going to have to let them go and try something else. So anyway, thank you.
All right, thanks. Wanda?
So I have to say that really, from a scientific standpoint and a conceptual framework, I really agreed most wholeheartedly with Joy and Pat's statements, although my voting didn't quite always align with that. In another venue, I would consider this data suggestive and promising and hypothesis generating, and it's being treated and was treated by the FDA as definitive. And I join Bob in being a bit disconcerted by that decision from the FDA, because there are other ways to do this. The reason that my voting didn't align with that is that I also, my day job, I deal with refractory and relapsing and end-line patients, and somehow that agita allowed me to treat this data with a bit more credibility, and I don't mean it in the sense of how the data was gathered, but I mean in the sense of the level of data that we have with more credibility than it actually has. And I'm particularly anxious about the fact that, as is the case with almost every therapy, we're making these judgments, these value judgments, as they were, on a population that's small and is at the extremes of risk, at the very, very extreme tail of the risk-benefit ratio. And it's going to creep back into lower risk folks. And at this point, I have no idea what the relative risk-benefit ratio is for them clinically, or from a value standpoint, and that leaves me with a lot of anxiety. We've discussed, I think on numerous occasions in CTAF, revisiting topics. This is probably the one that I feel most strongly about, because this is in many cases, at least in my short tenure, the least baked of data sets that we've had a chance to review.
Rena, thank you.
I think we're looking at a lot of breakthrough therapies here in the last couple of years, and breakthrough therapies are just, they're amazing. They feel like they're opening doors and providing treatments in conditions that we've had nothing, for individuals where we've had nothing, and that is fantastic. And as a parent and a clinician, I can't remember who said it's worth it. That rings true. At the same time, and I should say that the ICER analysis actually shocked me in terms of the cost per quality. It was wonderful. So if all of the assumptions built into the analysis are true and we're lacking tons of data, that's great. I have doubts, but assuming even if that's the case, I still don't understand the price. So that's separate from is it worth it? It's the breakthrough treatment, I'm all for it, but I don't know why it needs to be $500,000 a patient, or double that, which it looks like it will be when there's the markups. So that feels like it's taking advantage of the vulnerable patients and the wanting clinicians and the systems and the payers. That feels like it's taking advantage of the desperateness that we all feel. So even though the analysis looked good, and I have no different feelings about the weak, and premature level of the science that we have, the problem is that it feels like this is the new trend. that we're just going to see how much can we charge for situations when we have a breakthrough treatment, nothing else is there, everybody wants it, and we'll see what we can get away with. So analysis looks good, price tag still looks horrible.
All right, thanks.
Okay, my freebie medical term of the day is refractory. Refractory to treatment, refractory disease. That's the hide behind it term for the treatment failed the patient. I don't want to throw cold water on any of this at all. I agree. I've seen the facts. I've seen the figures. Patients are really being saved by this. That's all fabulous. My one big caution that I have to throw out here is I've been here before. I've actually seen this happen before. It's called bone marrow transplant for breast cancer about 20 years ago. It looked every bit this good. It sounded every bit this good. It had every bit this promise. There was every bit this much effort going into it. Hospitals were starting to build buildings where they could make money on it. People were starting to figure out ways where they could get in on the game. And it was a nasty mess when it actually blew up. And we got real world actual facts from the real population where we were trying to do this with. That's a large part of what all we're leery of. We don't have the real world data from real populations. We have selected data from very selective populations right now. And the future is not all promise. There are plenty of people that aren't the success that aren't here today. The failures we don't hear about, they're another 2 years down the road in the news. And we will hear about them too.
Thanks. Bob.
After over a decade of taxpayer-funded basic research into CAR T therapy, I'm really happy that this new treatment modality is clinically available, and it's great to hear your stories. For relapsed refractory ALL or aggressive non-Hodgkin's B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But my enthusiasm is tempered in part a lot by what you just discussed. Number one, the phase 1-2 study results likely overestimate the long-term response and benefit in the real world because of favorable selection bias. Patients entered on the studies all had normal or near normal performance status. And you know as this rolls out, people who are desperate, enter at the end of the line, are going to pull the brass ring and go for it. Next, the reported response rates were calculated on those who received the CAR T cells, not all study entrants. So it was not an intention to treat analysis and thus overstates the response rate. And last, there's short follow-up. Secondly, the long-term toxicity is simply unknown. And third, the extremely high cost, which sticks in my craw also. 373 to 475 as a ballpark, plus the hospital costs, plus the ancillary costs, you're likely to hit $1 million plus in the real world. This is going to add more financial stress to patients and their families, which is already considerable. I get phone calls from friends saying, I just got put on this new treatment, and the copay is $1,000 or $1,500 a month. We can't pay it. The drug company has an assistance program, but we're just above the threshold. What do you tell them? I tell them, call your congressman. You know, this is a broken system that allows this to happen. So I think the cost of this is going to add to the financial and emotional stress of patients who don't have good insurance. You're lucky. There are a lot of people that aren't. And I don't know how they feel. Well, I think I do. Medical expenses remain the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the U.S. So I have hope that CTAF and ICER's reports will help inform the debate and help implement a rational pricing and payment system for these new treatment modalities, which are on a steep upward curve.
Thank you. Thank you. Felicia.
This is going to sound strange for coming from someone with a background in religious ethics, but I want the proof. And I feel like we're being asked to accept almost on faith that these therapies work, will continue working, and will assure long-term successful outcomes, not just alive today or tomorrow, but next year, 10 years from now. So I want more. I think good ethics, good policy, and I'd argue good pricing all start with good facts. We don't have enough of those facts yet. I want so badly to believe that this is the game changer, that this will work, not just for these conditions, but others as well, because I think that's where we'll go next. So I want to believe. I do what you asked, Emily, every day. I put myself in patients' positions. I walk into those rooms. I have those hard family meetings, and they always ask, what would you do? And the doctors come to me and ask, should I offer this? You know, there are hard decisions that we all have to make every day. And right now, I just don't know what I would tell them. And if they say, is it worth it? I don't know. We just don't know.
Okay, thanks. Paul?
Well, I agree with a fellow panel members' concerns, but also great enthusiasm for the treatment. And so maybe I'll just comment briefly on where we can go from here with such a high uncertainty of benefit. Mm-hmm. It seems we either need long-term outcome-based prices. There's challenges to developing those, but things are at least a year or two where we look into mortality and remission. Or maybe even better is certainty-based pricing, where we start with a lower price, and then as more data come in and confirms that this is truly a game changer, the prices go up. That way we can keep providing this, but also limit the risk to the health system.
Thank you very much. So those were wonderful comments. I want to, before I make a few brief comments, I just wanted us all to acknowledge and thank the Policy Roundtable members who provided an extraordinary opportunity for us to delve into some of these deep issues. Thank you. So, my own sense, personal and brief, I hope, part of this meeting has shown the extreme weaknesses of cost-effectiveness analysis as a tool for decision-making. Because we had to take huge uncertainty and make some assumptions that were critically important to our general view of the long-term value. And the problem is that there's no easy way to say, okay, I'm really uncertain, but here's the best estimate we've got from this model. What do we do with that? How do we integrate those two senses of information? And with that, it does raise a lot of the policy recommendations that have come up. When we face these kinds of situations, doesn't it seem reasonable to say that we should mandate some kind of evidence generation to follow upon FDA approval? That it should be incredibly robust and incredibly clear, and the responsibility of the innovator? Shouldn't it be reasonable to assume that in extreme uncertainty, that the price should be modulated, and perhaps, as you said, Paul, perhaps another option would be for it to build up as experience and certainty grows? We can always talk about rebating after 2 years if it doesn't work, but the other direction is something as a policy channel that I think needs further development. And like Alex, I also feel that the best we can do with cost effectiveness and all the other considerations still fail us when we come to the challenging question of profit and who gains and how from these kinds of innovations. Because as we want more of them, but as we also want that ultimate goal of a sustainable platform for this, it's very possible that the most innovative companies will start digging a hole out of which we'll never kind of figure our way out as these kinds of treatments are becoming more effective for other people. It could be that we can afford it. We have to get rid of a few aircraft carriers and a few more public parks, or another school or two, or save money by not paying people too much elsewhere in the health system. And that's why, as much as the weakness of cost effectiveness was exposed here today, I also think the strength of public deliberation was revealed as well. Now, we didn't come to any things that we can walk out and march out of this room and do tomorrow necessarily, but we can sure put a megaphone behind some of the policy recommendations and insights and make sure that this kind of discussion continues. We will come back to this topic. It has to happen, and it has to happen. I'm guessing it'll be one of our quicker updates as we gather more information. And it may include new indications, but this is an area where we all want patients to benefit, more patients to benefit. To do that, we're going to have the evidence and think about the pricing and the payment, because without a good coordinated process that only the public can kind of force together in some ways, I think we won't get there. So we should applaud what the manufacturers, the patients who participated in the research, the doctors who were there, who have been part of that and will be there for the patients tomorrow. And we need them to all be part, along with the payers and the rest of the policymaking community, but also the public, in order for this kind of innovation to really make sense and to help all of us and our children. So thank you for coming today and participating in this meeting. CTAF has an important role to play. I would like to thank each and every one of the CTAF panel members today. The final report, which will include the votes and a summary of this discussion with policy recommendations, will be out by March 23rd. And thank you again. Krishna, thank you.